They laughed when she tripped, entering the ballroom, until the Duke took her hand and didn't let go. The grand assembly of the season had reached its pinnacle, the ballroom of Ashford House transformed into a cathedral of candlelight and orchestrated elegance. Gaslight flickered behind crystal sconces, casting amber shadows across the polished floor that gleamed like a dark mirror. The assembled company, dukes and duchesses, lords and ladies of considerable standing, moved through the space with the calculated grace of those accustomed to scrutiny, their voices a careful murmur beneath the violin's tender plea. Lysandra Hale had received precisely 17 minutes of instruction regarding the descent into such chambers. 17 minutes in which her patroness, the venerable Lady Ashworth, had imparted the essential wisdom: stand erect, advance with measured purpose, permit others to speak first, and above all, do not, under any circumstance, commit the cardinal sin of drawing unwarranted attention. She had remembered every word. She had forgotten, however, the particular malice of gaslight upon freshly polished marble. Her foot, the left one, clad in a satin slipper of the palest cream, found no purchase where it sought one. What followed was neither a tumble nor a fall, but rather a moment of terrible suspension, one instant in which Lysandra hung suspended between grace and catastrophe, her arms reaching outward as though she might embrace the very air itself. The silk of her gown, a modest white muslin adorned only with the faintest green trim, whispered a soft accusation as her body descended toward the unforgiving floor. The ballroom inhaled, then it laughed. Not unkindly at first, but with the cruel collective delight of a society that had been waiting with breath drawn for proof that Miss Hale did not in fact belong. The laughter began at the periphery, a suppressed snort from Lady Verena Calthorpe, whose smile never wavered even as she turned to her companion with a raised eyebrow, and rippled inward like a stone cast into still water. Fans snapped open with sharp finality. A duchess pretended to examine her jewels. The orchestra seemed to falter, as though the musicians themselves had become distracted by the spectacle unfolding before them. Lysandra's hands struck the marble. Not hard. She had managed, in that eternal moment of descent, to redirect the worst of her momentum, but with sufficient force that the impact echoed through the gathered assembly. Her dance card, which had been clutched in fingers gone suddenly nerveless, tumbled from her grasp and skittered across the floor, its ivory surface reflecting the light of 100 candles. She remained there for 3 seconds, long enough for shame to bloom hot and terrible across her throat, long enough for her carefully arranged curls to tumble slightly from their restraint, long enough for her to understand with absolute certainty that she had confirmed every whispered doubt the ton had harbored regarding her suitability for their company. Then she heard the silence. It was not the silence of continued laughter arrested mid-breath. It was something far more profound, a cessation so complete that the orchestra, which had been struggling valiantly to maintain the waltz, seemed to recognize it and withdrew into hushed resolve. Even the gaslight seemed to burn less brightly, as though the room itself held its breath. Lysandra lifted her gaze from the marble floor. A man stood in the archway that led from the reception chamber into the ballroom proper. He was very tall, tall enough that his head nearly brushed the ornate crown molding, and broad across the shoulders, in a manner that suggested his tailor possessed considerable skill in disguising what was, in truth, unapologetic muscularity. His coat was of charcoal grey wool, a colour so severe that it seemed to drain the warmth from the surrounding air. His waistcoat was the deep purple of wine long aged in cellars, and his cravat was tied with the precision of a man who had fought many battles and won them all. But it was his face that commanded attention. Strong, marked by lines that spoke of command and occasional cruelty, with eyes the colour of storm clouds gathering over distant moors, the Duke of Ashford, the very man whose house she had entered, whose invitation had rescued her from the narrowing circle of unsuitable young ladies of middling fortune and moderate connection, whose estate was rumoured to contain a library that contained first editions older than kingdoms, whose father had been mad, and whose mother had withdrawn to the country to escape scandal, who walked through London drawing stares and whispers like a thundercloud draws lightning. For a moment, perhaps 2, he simply regarded the scene with an expression of perfect, absolute neutrality. Then, without breaking eye contact with Lysandra, he began to move. His pace was unhurried, his stride measured, but there was something in his bearing that suggested a predator whose patience had at last been rewarded with glimpse of worthy prey. The assembled company parted before him as though compelled by some invisible current of air. Her heart, which had been hammering against her ribs with all the panic of a bird trapped in glass, seemed suddenly to still. He stopped directly above her, his shadow falling across her entirely, and extended his hand. It was not a gloved hand. His gloves hung unused at his wrist, and she could see the calluses that marked his palms, the strength evident even in repose. The candlelight caught the iron ring that adorned his thumb, a signet unmarked by any crest, as though he required no heraldry to announce his station. "Madam," he said, and his voice was precisely as dark as his eyes, low, careful, each word placed with the deliberation of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "Permit me." Lysandra placed her trembling fingers into his palm. The transformation that occurred in the instant their hands met was neither explicable by natural philosophy nor attributable to the tricks of gaslight and shadow. It was simply that the world, which had only moments before seemed composed entirely of her own mortification and the cruel delight of 1,000 watching eyes, suddenly reduced itself to this single point of contact. The warmth of his hand, the steady reassurance of his grip, the undeniable fact that the Duke of Ashford was in that moment refusing to release her. He drew her to her feet with the ease of a man lifting a child, and she rose as though pulled upward by invisible threads attached to her very soul. She found herself standing perhaps 18 inches from his chest, her head tilted back to meet his gaze, acutely aware that her hair had come somewhat loose, and that her hands, when she risked a glance downward, were trembling with the force of returning circulation. "I am unharmed, Your Grace," she said, and was obscurely proud that her voice remained steady. "I shall not further detain you from your—" "You shall not detain me," he interrupted, and the corner of his mouth rose in what might have been amusement or might have been something far more dangerous. "I have no pressing engagement save one, and it is unfolding presently." The ballroom, she became aware, had resumed a kind of tentative animation. The orchestra, reassured by the Duke's apparent lack of distress, had returned to their waltz. Couples had begun once more to move through their patterns, but every eye in the assembly, every single eye, remained fixed upon the tableau that the Duke had created. Himself, the apparent savior of an unfortunate young woman, and Lysandra herself, still tethered to his hand as though by chains of iron and propriety. "The lady," the Duke announced to no one in particular, though his words rang through the space with the clarity of a bell struck at matins, "appears to require a moment of recovery. I shall escort her to the garden. The evening air is remarkably clement." It was not a request. It was barely a statement. It was more properly categorized as a decree, pronounced with such casual certainty that the assembled company seemed incapable of formulating objection. Lady Verena Calthorpe's smile froze upon her face. A duchess opened her fan with particular violence, but no one, not a single voice in that gathering of powerful, opinionated aristocrats, moved to contradict him. Lysandra, clutching her dance card, which he had retrieved for her in one smooth motion before extending his hand a second time, permitted herself to be drawn from the ballroom. They moved through the reception chamber and beyond, through corridors lined with portraits of his ancestors, past footmen who bowed so deeply they nearly folded in half, toward a pair of French doors that opened onto a garden still fragrant with the remnants of summer's generosity. The night air was indeed clement. It was also, she discovered, cool enough to raise the fine hairs upon her arms and to remind her sharply that she was alone, entirely alone, with one of the most powerful and enigmatic men in London. "You did not belong on that floor," the Duke said without preamble, releasing her hand only to gesture toward a stone bench positioned beneath a climbing rose that glowed silver in the moonlight. "The assembly is composed by and large of persons whose dignity rests upon the foundation of never acknowledging their own vulnerability. They laugh at your stumble because they live in terror of their own." Lysandra sank onto the bench, her gown settling around her in soft layers. "That is a generous interpretation, Your Grace. I fear the simpler explanation is that I am merely inadequate to the demands of such an occasion." "Then you are a liar," he said, and the bluntness of it was shocking enough that she lifted her gaze to meet his. He was watching her with an intensity that made her feel as though she were a text written in a language only he possessed the capacity to read. "Your composure upon rising was remarkable. A woman truly inadequate to her circumstances would have dissolved into tears or, at minimum, displayed some small amount of hysteria. You, Miss Hale, did neither." She had not considered this. In the immediate aftermath of her mortification, she had been too occupied with the simple matter of remaining upright, of permitting her hands to cease their trembling, of avoiding the bottomless pit of humiliation that yawned before her. That her response might have been interpreted as something approaching stoicism had not occurred to her. "I was taught by my father," she said slowly, "that a lady's greatest power lies not in her beauty or her fortune or even her connections. It lies in her capacity to remain serene when the world conspires to discompose her." He believed that propriety begins not with the strictness of our adherence to rules, but with the respect we maintain for ourselves and others, regardless of circumstance. The Duke was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice had taken on a quality that she could only describe as tender, a softness wholly at odds with the severity of his features. "Your father," he said, "was a wise man, and you, Miss Hale, are the product of his wisdom." The return to the ballroom occurred precisely as the orchestra struck up the opening measures of a new waltz. The Duke escorted Lysandra through the French doors, with his hand at the small of her back, a gesture that seemed to announce to every assembled observer that whatever had occurred in the garden had been conducted with his express approval and, by extension, with absolute propriety. The weight of his palm through the thin silk of her gown communicated something rather different, something that made her breath catch and her cheeks bloom with color that had nothing whatsoever to do with shame. The gathering fell silent once more as they approached the ballroom floor. Lysandra was acutely aware of the scrutiny they faced, the 1,000-minute adjustments being made to calculations and presumptions. A dukedom was not to be dismissed lightly. Neither were the implicit endorsements that such attention conveyed. What had been, moments before, a confirmation of her inadequacy was now rapidly being reassessed by minds far more politically sophisticated than her own. The Duke paused at the edge of the polished floor. He turned to face her and extended his hand in the formal gesture that preceded the waltz. "Miss Hale," he said, and there was something in his voice that suggested this moment had been, in some fashion, inevitable, since the moment she had first accepted Lady Ashworth's invitation. "I should be honored to partner you for the first waltz of the evening." The tongue, which had been reduced to murmuring speculation, seemed to exhale as a single organism. This was not, after all, merely an act of chivalry. This was a public claim, a statement made before witnesses that the Duke of Ashford had selected her, of all the ladies present, for that most essential of honors. A dance card that had moments before remained conspicuously empty was now the subject of envious observation. Lysandra placed her hand in his and they moved onto the floor. The sensation of the waltz was unlike anything she had experienced, a suspension between music and motion, between propriety and the strange intimacy of being held at waist by a man whose presence seemed to fill the entire space around them. His hand at her back was warm, and she was suddenly acutely aware of the fact that there was perhaps only a single layer of cloth separating her skin from his palm. The thought was mortifying and thrilling in equal measure. They moved through the steps with perfect synchronicity. She had expected perhaps some awkwardness. He was larger than most men, his frame more substantial than the slender dancers she had previously partnered. Instead, he moved with the grace of a man who had been trained since childhood in the arts of ballroom decorum, despite the severity of his bearing suggesting he might, at any moment, simply walk away from such frivolous pursuits. "You dance beautifully," she ventured, uncertain whether such an observation constituted appropriate conversation during a waltz. "I learned from necessity," he replied, "not inclination. My mother believed that a gentleman of rank was obligated to master the civilities, regardless of his personal preferences. I honor her memory by executing each step with appropriate precision." "Your mother sounds formidable," Lysandra observed. "She was," the Duke agreed, and there was something in the past tense of that verb that suggested layers of complexity she lacked the wisdom to explore. "She would have approved of you, I suspect. She had little patience for women who permitted the opinions of others to reduce them to insignificance." The waltz continued, and Lysandra became aware that they had become the central focus of the ballroom, not in the manner of spectacle or scandal, but in the way that a constellation draws the eye among lesser stars. She could feel the weight of observation, the whispers being exchanged behind fans and gloved hands. By morning, she suspected, every gossip column in London would be speculating about the Duke's interest in a girl of modest fortune and moderate connection. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, she found herself smiling. "What amuses you?" the Duke asked, his eyes intent upon her face. "Only that I arrived at this ball in the firm conviction that I would spend the evening as a wallflower of considerable invisibility," she replied. "I did not anticipate that my humiliation would prove to be the very mechanism by which I achieved a degree of notice." He smiled then, a real smile, not the careful arrangement of features that constituted most aristocratic expressions. It transformed his entire countenance, rendering him suddenly human rather than mythological. "Life," he said softly, "is composed almost entirely of such irony. The things we dread most often become the foundation upon which our greatest fortunes are constructed. You did not trip accidentally, Miss Hale. You were brought down so that you might rise with considerably greater dignity than you possessed before." The waltz drew to its conclusion, and he released her with visible reluctance. The moment his hand fell away from her waist, she felt the absence of him like a physical ache. He escorted her to the periphery of the ballroom, where her patroness waited with an expression of barely suppressed elation. "The Duke," Lady Ashworth whispered urgently, "has requested that you attend a recital at his residence on Thursday evening. I trust you have no prior engagements." Lysandra, watching as the Duke disappeared into the crowd of admirers and petitioners that always seemed to gravitate toward him, found herself possessed of a certainty she could not fully explain. "I find," she said slowly, "that I shall endeavor to make myself available for any engagement His Grace might propose." The interval between the ball and Thursday evening passed, with the curious elongation that accompanies anticipation. Lysandra found herself moving through the days as though suspended in amber, each hour acquiring weight and significance it had not previously possessed. She attended a musical at the residence of a minor countess, endured the pointed inquiries of ladies who had previously regarded her with indifference, and submitted to the unrelenting scrutiny of her patroness, who seemed determined to catalogue every detail of the Duke's conduct during their waltz. "He held you at an entirely appropriate distance," Lady Ashworth observed, with the satisfaction of a woman whose protégé had acquired unexpected value. "His gaze, when directed toward you, suggested genuine attention rather than mere politeness, and he requested your presence at a private recital. Miss Hale, do you comprehend what this signifies?" Lysandra, who spent the greater portion of her waking hours attempting to suppress precisely this comprehension, murmured something non-committal and returned her attention to the embroidery she had been neglecting with consistent enthusiasm. What the Duke's conduct signified was impossible to determine with any degree of certainty. He might have been motivated by nothing more than a nobleman's obligation to shield a guest from public ridicule. He might have been amused by her composure and sought to investigate whether it extended beyond the initial display, or he might have been motivated by something that her heart, foolish, unguarded organ, insisted upon interpreting as interest of a romantic nature. This last possibility was, of course, ridiculous. The Duke of Ashford occupied a sphere of existence entirely removed from that inhabited by the daughter of a botanist, regardless of her father's respectability or her own modest accomplishments. He was accustomed to women of rank, of considerable fortune, of ancestors stretching back through centuries of documented importance. That he had singled her out for attention was fortunate. That he should harbor any deeper regard was the province of fairy tales and the sort of romantic novels that respectable ladies pretended not to read. And yet Thursday approached with inexorable certainty. She selected her gown with excruciating care, a pale blue silk that she had purchased expressly for occasions of particular importance, trimmed with ivory lace that had required 3 weeks of labor to complete. She arranged her hair in a style that was neither too austere nor too elaborate, and permitted her lady's maid to apply the faintest suggestion of color to her lips. When she arrived at Ashford House, having been collected by the Duke's carriage precisely at the appointed hour, she felt simultaneously overdressed and inadequately prepared. The recital chamber was situated on the upper floor, a space that seemed to have been designed expressly to showcase the marriage of music and architecture. The ceiling rose to considerable height, and the walls were lined with panels of deep mahogany that seemed to absorb and transform sound into something more refined than its raw acoustic origins. Sconces held candles that cast a warm, amber light across the assembled company, perhaps 30 persons in total, all of considerable rank, all of whom turned to observe her entrance with an interest that suggested her presence had been announced in advance. The Duke stood near the pianoforte, conversing with an elderly gentleman whose silver hair and distinguished bearing marked him as a person of significance. When the Duke perceived her arrival, he excused himself immediately and moved to greet her with a formality that would have seemed cold had his eyes not communicated something rather different. "Miss Hale," he said, executing a bow that was precisely calibrated to her station, respectful without being obsequious. "You honor my home with your presence. I trust the journey was not unduly fatiguing." "Not at all, Your Grace," she replied, acutely aware that they were being observed by every person in the chamber. "Your carriage is remarkably well sprung." A faint smile played at the corners of his mouth. "I selected it with the comfort of my guests in mind. Shall I present you to some of the assembled company, or would you prefer to take a position of observation?" She found herself choosing the latter, and he escorted her to a chair positioned near a substantial potted orchid, a plant of such exotic beauty that she could not refrain from examining it more closely. "It is remarkable," she murmured, studying the delicate structure of the bloom. "It is," the Duke agreed, and she became aware that he was studying her face rather than the flower. "I acquired it from a collector who claimed it originated in the East Indies. The cultivation requires considerable patience and a very precise understanding of moisture and light, much like the development of human excellence, I suspect, demanding conditions but capable of producing extraordinary beauty." Before she could formulate a response to this observation, the recital commenced. A soprano of considerable renown performed a selection of Italian arias, her voice rising and falling with the precision of a master craftsman. Lysandra found herself moved to tears by the final aria, a lament of such profound sorrow that it seemed to articulate emotions she had previously lacked the vocabulary to express. When the performance concluded, the Duke remained at her side throughout the interval, introducing her to persons of rank, a marquess and his wife, a bishop of considerable learning, a widow of indeterminate age who possessed opinions on music that were as forceful as they were informed. They conversed as though her presence among them was entirely natural, as though a girl of her station belonged in such exalted company. As the evening drew toward its conclusion, the Duke offered her his arm to escort her toward the exit. In the dimly lit corridor he paused, turning to face her with an expression of unusual gravity. "I have a confession to make," he said softly. "My motivation for inviting you this evening was not entirely altruistic. I wished to observe whether your composure at the ball was merely a response to immediate crisis, or whether it constituted a fundamental aspect of your character." "And have you reached a conclusion, Your Grace?" she asked, her heart executing peculiar gymnastics within her chest. "I have," he replied. "You possess not merely the capacity to endure adversity with dignity, but the capacity to find grace within such moments. It is a rare quality, Miss Hale. I find myself increasingly disinclined to permit our association to terminate with tonight's entertainment." The following week produced 3 additional invitations from the Duke of Ashford. The first was to a private viewing of his considerable art collection, during which he discussed each painting with an erudition that suggested far deeper knowledge than his reputation as a man of action would typically permit. The second was to an afternoon excursion through Kew Gardens, where he revealed himself to possess a botanical knowledge that rivaled her late father's, and where they spoke for several hours of plant taxonomy and the botanical discoveries that were revolutionizing scientific understanding. It was during this second expedition that he asked her about her father. They had paused beside an exemplary specimen of jasmine, and he had turned to her with an expression of genuine curiosity that suggested the question had been carefully considered before its utterance. "Lady Ashworth mentioned that your father was a man of scientific inclination," he said. "What transpired in your household following his death?" The question, which might have seemed intrusive from another person, felt instead like an offering of understanding. She found herself responding with an honesty that surprised her. "My father left no estate of particular value," she said quietly. "He was more devoted to his research than to the accumulation of wealth. Upon his death, my mother and I were forced to seek refuge with various relations, none of whom possessed either the inclination or the resources to support us indefinitely. When my mother subsequently succumbed to a putrid fever, I became dependent upon the charitable inclinations of a distant cousin who possessed a sufficient tolerance for eccentricity to permit me to remain in her household." "And your current situation?" "Lady Ashworth has taken me into her household as a sort of companion. I perform various services. I assist in the management of her correspondence. I accompany her to social occasions. I provide intellectual companionship that her own family lacks the capacity to offer. In exchange, she provides me with adequate housing and the opportunity to move within circles that would otherwise remain closed to me. It is an arrangement that is, I believe, satisfactory to both parties." The Duke was quiet for a considerable interval. When he spoke again, his voice held a note of something that might have been anger, though the anger did not seem directed toward her. You describe your existence as though it were a series of tolerable circumstances, rather than the deprivation that it actually constitutes, he said. A woman of your intelligence and accomplishment should not be dependent upon the whims of distant relatives and aging patronesses. You should possess your own establishment, your own resources, your own authority over your life. As should many women, Your Grace, she replied gently, but society has ordained that our existences be contingent upon the goodwill of men. I have learned to accept this reality with as much grace as I can muster. Then perhaps, he said, and there was something in his voice that suggested he was committing himself to a course of action with significant consequences. It is time to alter that reality, for you, at minimum. The third invitation came in the form of a letter, delivered by a footman with explicit instruction that it be presented to her personally. Her hands trembled as she broke the seal, a crest of iron and stone that seemed to contain all the weight of his station within its geometric simplicity. The handwriting was precise, masculine, marked by the careful deliberation of a man who chose his words with exactitude. Miss Hale, I find myself possessed of a proposition that, given its delicate nature, cannot appropriately be conveyed through the conventional channels available to a gentleman of my station. I have therefore requested that you attend a private meeting in my library on Saturday evening at 8 o'clock. I give you my word that this meeting will be conducted with absolute propriety and with the knowledge and implicit approval of Lady Ashworth. Should you choose to attend, your life may undergo transformations the nature of which I cannot predetermine. Should you choose to decline, I shall accept your decision with the grace it deserves, and our association shall continue upon the terms currently established. I confess that I hope, most ardently, for the former outcome. Yours in steadfast regard, Caelum Vaughn. Duke of Ashford. Lysandra read the letter 3 times, each reading producing new tremors of comprehension. A proposal, she understood, was being offered, but of what precise nature remained tantalizingly obscure. She showed the letter to Lady Ashworth, who read it with an expression of such profound satisfaction that she resembled a cat that had successfully cornered a particularly substantial mouse. You must attend, her patroness declared with absolute certainty. The Duke has demonstrated a degree of interest in your person that transcends mere politeness. What he intends to propose I cannot determine with certainty, but I assure you that his offer, whatever its nature, will constitute the most advantageous opportunity that shall ever be presented to you. Saturday evening arrived with the inevitability of doom. Lysandra dressed with meticulous care, selecting a gown of pale grey silk that conveyed neither excessive formality nor insufficient respect for the occasion. She arrived at Ashford House at precisely 8 o'clock, her heart executing a rhythm that seemed wholly disproportionate to the simple act of ascending a staircase. The library was exactly as she had imagined it, vast, illuminated by a substantial fire, lined floor to ceiling with volumes bound in leather that had acquired the patina of considerable age. The Duke stood near the hearth, his figure silhouetted against the flames, and he turned at her entrance with an expression that combined hope and fear in equal measure. You came, he said simply. I did, she replied, and found herself similarly moved by the complexity of emotions reflected in his countenance. He gestured toward a chair positioned before the fire, and she sank into it with a grace that belied the tumultuous nature of her inner state. He remained standing, and she became aware that he was experiencing some difficulty in formulating the words he wished to convey. It was extraordinary, she reflected, how much his uncertainty humanized him. He was not the formidable Duke of society's consciousness in this moment, but rather a man confronting something that threatened the foundations of his carefully constructed existence. I have spent the greater portion of my existence, he began at last, constructing barriers between myself and the world, my father's madness, my mother's shame, the necessity of preserving a dukedom that had become synonymous with scandal. All of these circumstances conspired to convince me that isolation was the superior option to vulnerability. I have cultivated a reputation for severity precisely because severity prevents the formation of the attachments that lead inevitably to suffering. He paused, and she waited with the patience of one who understands that such revelations cannot be hurried. When you fell, he continued, something within me recognized itself in your composure. I perceived in you a person who had experienced sufficient adversity to understand the necessity of dignity, yet who had retained the capacity to extend grace to others. It was a recognition, Miss Hale, of a kindred spirit, and I found myself incapable of permitting you to retreat into invisibility. Your Grace, she said softly. "I am moved by your kindness, but I fear I do not comprehend the nature of the proposition you have intimated." He turned to face her fully, and she perceived that he was gripping the mantelpiece with sufficient force to suggest his emotional state was bordering upon the precarious. "I am proposing," he said, his voice low and intense, "that you permit me to alter the circumstances of your existence. Not through the conventional channel of matrimony, which I comprehend would be a step too presumptuous, given the brevity of our acquaintance, but through an arrangement of a more creative nature. I possess the resources to establish you with your own residence, adequate income, and the freedom to conduct your life according to your own determinations. In exchange, I ask only that you permit me to know you, to comprehend your thoughts, to understand your wishes, to perhaps over time transition our association into something that society would recognize as matrimony." Lysandra found herself incapable of speech. The proposition was extraordinary in its scope, unprecedented in its generosity, and wholly inappropriate according to every convention she had been taught to revere. It was also precisely what she had begun to desire with increasing desperation. "Your Grace," she said finally, "you understand that such an arrangement would render me utterly dependent upon your continued regard? That should your affections alter, I would find myself abandoned in a position of even greater precarity than my current circumstances." "I do," he said, and there was something in his voice that transcended mere acknowledgement. "And I offer you my sacred oath that my regard for you will not alter. I do not speak of the transitory passion that society recognizes as romantic love. I speak of something far more durable, a recognition of your essential worth, a conviction that your happiness constitutes a matter of profound personal importance to me, a commitment to your welfare that shall persist regardless of circumstance." He moved toward her then and extended his hand. When she placed her fingers within his palm, he drew her to her feet and held her gaze with an intensity that seemed to penetrate the carefully constructed defenses she had erected around her heart. "Permit me," he said, and the words carried weight, far exceeding their literal meaning, "to become the circumstance that alters your life." The establishment that the Duke secured for Lysandra was situated in Belgrave Square, a residence of such evident quality and considerable expense that she spent the greater portion of her first week simply wandering through its rooms in a state of bewildered wonder. It was a house intended for a woman of rank, appointed with furnishings that suggested the taste of someone who understood that beauty and functionality were not mutually exclusive. The library, and there was naturally a substantial library, was stocked with volumes that seemed to have been selected with her own intellectual preferences in mind, including several botanical treatises of considerable rarity and an entire collection of poetry that ranged from the classics to the most contemporary works. The servants had been selected, she rapidly discovered, for their discretion and their inclination to treat her not as a woman of questionable morality, but as the mistress of the establishment she indisputably was. The housekeeper, a woman of considerable years and even more considerable dignity, managed the household with such efficiency that Lysandra found herself required to do little more than indicate her preferences regarding meals and the arrangement of the drawing-room. The Duke visited 3 times weekly, a frequency that was simultaneously insufficient to satisfy her burgeoning attachment and adequate to prevent the household from becoming the subject of unmanageable gossip. These visits followed a pattern that was remarkably consistent. He would arrive in the late afternoon. They would take tea together in the drawing-room whilst discussing literature or science or the peculiar management of London's social hierarchies, and as evening approached, he would depart with a formality that suggested their relationship remained entirely platonic. This last aspect was the source of considerable internal conflict for Lysandra. She found herself acutely aware of his physical presence in a manner that conventional propriety had not prepared her to manage. The proximity of him when they were seated upon the same sofa, reviewing a volume of botanical illustrations, produced a sensation not unlike the pressure that precedes a thunderstorm. The occasional moment when his hand brushed against hers as they both reached for the same page resulted in heat that seemed to originate from her very core and radiate outward until her entire being felt as though it were composed of flame. He seemed, paradoxically, to be experiencing a similar difficulty. His gaze, when directed toward her, often carried a weight that exceeded what the situation demanded. The careful distance he maintained between them suggested it was a distance that required conscious effort to sustain. His voice, in moments when their conversation turned toward subjects of particular intimacy, acquired a quality that was almost rough. as though he were struggling to maintain the proprieties he had established. It was during his visit on a Thursday evening in the third week of her residence that the situation achieved a point of inevitable transformation. He had brought with him a volume of poetry, Byron specifically, the passages of which were marked with a precision that suggested considerable deliberation. He had asked her to read aloud, a request she found somewhat unusual given that they had previously simply discussed literature rather than performing it for one another. She selected a passage and began to read, "I love the language, that soft bastard Latin, which melts like kisses from a female mouth." When she glanced upward from the page, she perceived that his expression had undergone a transformation. The careful propriety that usually characterized his bearing had been displaced by something raw, more primitive, entirely lacking in the refinement that society demanded. "Miss Hale," he said, his voice low and strained, "I must confess that my patience regarding our current arrangement is approaching its terminus." Her heart ceased its normal rhythm and acquired instead a cadence reminiscent of distant thunder. "What do you propose, Your Grace?" she asked, though she suspected she already comprehended the answer. He rose from his chair and moved toward the fireplace, his posture suggesting internal conflict of considerable magnitude. "I propose," he said without turning to face her, "that we alter the nature of our association. Not through the formality of marriage, I would not wish you to feel that society's conventions constrain your choices, but through a commitment that transcends the requirements of propriety. I wish to know you, Miss Hale, not merely as a woman of intellectual accomplishment, but as the essential being you are in all moments. I wish to remove the careful distance that I have maintained, and I wish to permit myself the extraordinary privilege of loving you without the restraint of social convention." She rose from her chair, her legs trembling with a combination of fear and anticipation. "Your Grace," she said softly, "I believe you will discover that I have harbored similar wishes for some considerable interval." He turned then, and the expression in his eyes suggested that he had been subjected to a revelation of profound significance. He crossed the distance between them with a purposefulness that left her no doubt regarding his intentions, and when he reached her, he extended his hand with the same gesture he had employed when she lay upon the marble floor of the ballroom, an offer not of rescue, but of alliance. "Then permit me," he said, "to love you as you deserve." The transformation that occurred in the subsequent weeks was neither sudden nor dramatic, but rather gradual, like the progression of dawn across a landscape previously obscured by darkness. The Duke's visits acquired a new dimension of intimacy that transcended the merely physical, though that aspect was certainly present. When he took her hand now, it was with the full intention of maintaining contact, his fingers intertwining with hers, as though asserting a claim that society had not yet recognized, but which felt, to Lysandra, entirely inevitable. They spent entire evenings in conversation that ranged across subjects both profound and quotidian. She learned that his earliest memory was of his father's voice, raised in anger, echoing through corridors lined with ancestral portraits. She discovered that his reputed coldness toward London society stemmed not from indifference, but from a recognition that most interactions were predicated upon deception, that people presented carefully curated versions of themselves rather than their authentic selves, and that he had grown fatigued by the effort of maintaining such performances. In return, she offered him the narrative of her own existence, the loss of her father when she was but 18, the subsequent dissolution of her social position, the years spent in relative obscurity whilst watching other women of her acquaintance secure advantageous matches and establish themselves within the hierarchies that governed feminine existence. She spoke of the quiet desperation that had underlain her acceptance of Lady Ashworth's offer, the way in which financial dependence had corroded her sense of agency, the profound relief she had experienced upon discovering that the Duke's regard for her was genuine rather than performative. "You possess a capacity for honesty that is quite extraordinary," he said one evening, as they sat together in the library, his arm positioned around her shoulders with a casualness that suggested it had always belonged there. "Most women of your station spend their entire existence engaged in the construction of acceptable narratives regarding their circumstances. You, by contrast, acknowledge the truth of your deprivation and permit it to illuminate rather than diminish your character." "I learned from my father," she replied, leaning into the warmth of his presence, "that truth is the only foundation upon which authentic human connection can be constructed. He believed that pretense, no matter how carefully maintained, ultimately crumbles beneath the weight of its own duplicity. I have attempted to honor his memory by adhering to that principle." As the autumn progressed toward winter, the Duke began to introduce the possibility of marriage with increasing frequency. It was not a formal proposal. Indeed, he seemed reluctant to reduce the matter to the conventional formula of such arrangements. Instead, he would pose it as a question, a supposition, a gentle interrogation regarding her hypothetical receptiveness to such an arrangement. "If I were to petition society for the right to claim you as my wife," he said one November evening, whilst they walked through the small garden that adjoined her residence, "would you find such a course wholly objectionable?" "I would find it surprising," she admitted, "given that you have previously suggested that the institution of marriage itself is an accommodation to society's requirements rather than a necessity dictated by genuine affection." "My position regarding marriage," he replied, pausing beside a frost-touched rose that still clung to its stem despite the encroaching winter, "has undergone considerable revision. I believed myself incapable of the vulnerability that matrimony demands. I believed that maintaining autonomy was preferable to the risk of emotional devastation that inevitably accompanies the opening of one's heart to another person. You have demonstrated to me through the simple fact of your existence that I was incorrect. They were standing very close now, and the winter air seemed to have acquired a quality of suspended animation, as though the world itself was waiting for something of significance to occur. Your Grace," she said softly, "I must confess that I am uncertain regarding the precise nature of the question you are posing. Is this an expression of tentative inquiry, or is this a formal proposal?" He reached into his waistcoat and withdrew a small box of velvet, opening it to reveal a ring of remarkable simplicity, a single stone of considerable size and flawless clarity, set in silver rather than the gold that convention would typically suggest. "It is," he said, and his voice carried the weight of absolute certainty, "a formal proposal, Miss Hale. I am asking you to become my wife, not because society demands it, not because propriety requires it, but because my existence has acquired a dimension of meaning in your presence that I did not believe myself capable of experiencing. I am asking you to permit me to spend the remainder of my existence in the service of your happiness. I am asking you to accept my heart, which I offer to you now with the understanding that you hold within your hands the capacity to obliterate it entirely, and that I consent to this vulnerability because it is the only authentic response available to me." She took the ring from the box with trembling fingers, and he slipped it onto her hand with a gesture that seemed to consecrate the moment. It fit perfectly, as though it had been designed expressly for her. "Yes," she said simply, and the word seemed inadequate to the magnitude of her affirmation. "Yes, Your Grace, I shall become your wife, and I shall endeavor, for the remainder of my existence, to prove worthy of the extraordinary privilege you have extended to me." He drew her into his embrace then, and the kiss that followed seemed to contain all the longing that had accumulated across the weeks of careful restraint. It was a kiss that spoke of surrender and triumph simultaneously, that acknowledged both the intensity of their passion and the depth of their intellectual connection. When he released her, his forehead remained pressed against hers, and she could feel the rapid cadence of his heartbeat. "I love you," he whispered against her hair. Not with the theatrical intensity that poets describe, but with a love that is grounded in absolute knowledge of who you are and an unwavering conviction that you are precisely the person I require in order to become the man I aspire to be. The announcement of their engagement precipitated a reaction throughout London society that ranged from bewilderment to outright scandal. The daughter of a botanist, previously known only for her unfortunate tumble into the arms of the Duke of Ashford, was now to become a duchess, a position that typically required centuries of accumulated family importance and the substantial fortune that such lineage usually conveyed. The gossip columns were merciless in their speculation regarding the precise mechanisms through which such an elevation had occurred. Some suggested that she possessed unusual accomplishments in domains that convention prevented from being publicly acknowledged. Others intimated that the Duke had experienced some sort of mental deterioration that had resulted in a lapse of judgment. A particularly vicious columnist suggested that she had employed methods of seduction of a character too scandalous to be explicitly detailed, but which were nonetheless implied with sufficient clarity that her reputation hung in a precarious equilibrium. Lady Verena Calthorpe, who had initially been displaced by the Duke's evident interest in Lysandra, seized upon this opportunity with the enthusiasm of a predator scenting blood. She made a point of encountering Lysandra at a musicale at which both were present, and addressed her with a smile that did not extend to her eyes. "My dear Miss Hale," she said, employing the diminutive form of address with deliberate intent to suggest continued inferiority. How extraordinary that you have managed to secure His Grace's affections so thoroughly. One must confess oneself curious regarding the mechanisms through which such an achievement was accomplished. Lysandra, who had anticipated precisely such an attack, responded with a composure that seemed to surprise her antagonist. "I fear, Lady Verena, that your curiosity shall remain unsatisfied," she replied with icy precision. "The mechanisms of the Duke's affections are comprehensible to no one save himself, and he has not chosen to elaborate upon them with the assembled company. I suggest that you direct your attentions toward matters within the scope of your legitimate concern." The rebuke, delivered with sufficient coldness to freeze the immediate vicinity, resulted in Lady Verena's retreat with a fury that was barely concealed beneath her social mask. Word of the exchange spread with remarkable rapidity through the circles of London society, and Lysandra discovered that her status had undergone a profound alteration. She was no longer the unfortunate girl whose presence might be tolerated. She was now a woman of considerable power, whose position gave her the authority to dismiss the attacks of those who had previously tormented her. The wedding itself was scheduled for Christmas Eve, a date that the Duke had selected with deliberation. He claimed that he wished to begin their marriage during a season of renewal and hope, and that marking the occasion with the traditional celebrations of the Christian calendar would situate their union within the context of something larger and more significant than mere personal preference. The preparations were executed with the precision that characterized everything the Duke undertook. His estate was transformed into a cathedral of winter beauty. Garlands of evergreen trimmed with white silk ribbons adorned every doorway. Candles flickered in windows to guide the guests through the frost-touched darkness, and the chapel itself was decorated with white roses and ivy that seemed to suggest the triumph of life, even in the depths of winter. Lysandra found herself the object of considerable attention from the Duchess of Ashford's distant relations, persons of considerable rank who had maintained a rather distant attitude toward the Duke following the scandal that had enveloped his parents' generation. Now they circled her with the enthusiasm of those who recognized that she had acquired unexpected value, and she discovered herself required to navigate the complex terrain of aristocratic family dynamics with a grace that she did not entirely feel. It was the Duke himself who proved to be her steadiest refuge during this period of transition. He made a point of ensuring that they had moments of solitude amidst the constant stream of preparations and social obligations, and in these moments he would remind her of the fundamental truth that had drawn them together. "You are not required to transform yourself into something other than what you are," he said on the evening before their wedding, as they stood together in the library of his country estate. "The ton may demand that you adopt certain mannerisms, certain modes of dress and speech that correspond to their expectations, but I am not requiring any such accommodation. I love you precisely as you are, a woman of intellectual distinction, moral courage, and remarkable capacity for grace, even in the face of adversity." She held his words close to her heart as she donned her wedding gown on Christmas Eve, a creation of white silk and ivory lace that had required the efforts of 3 seamstresses working across 6 weeks. The veil was edged with the tiniest pearls, and her only adornment besides the Duke's ring was a small brooch of silver and sapphire that had belonged to his mother, a woman she had never met, but whose memory seemed to hover benevolently over the occasion. As she made her way down the aisle of the chapel, guided by a distant cousin who served as proxy for her absent father, she perceived the Duke standing at the altar. He was dressed in formal black, his bearing that of a man who commanded armies and bent kingdoms to his will, and yet when his gaze found hers, all that strength seemed to collapse into something far more vulnerable, the expression of a man witnessing the culmination of a hope he had scarcely permitted himself to acknowledge. The vicar performed the ceremony with the solemn precision that the occasion demanded, and when he asked whether anyone present knew of any impediment to the marriage, Lysandra found herself holding her breath, but silence fell, a silence that seemed to consecrate the moment, and the vicar proceeded to unite them in the eyes of God and society. When the Duke took her hand to place the ring upon her finger, his grip was firm and certain, as though he were anchoring himself to reality itself through this single point of contact. "I take thee to be my wife," he said, his voice resonating through the chapel with absolute conviction, "to have and to hold, from this day forward to love and to cherish, until death do us part. I pledge to you my honor, my protection, my unwavering devotion, and my profound conviction that you are the person with whom I am destined to spend the remainder of my existence." The weeks that followed the wedding proceeded with a dreamlike quality, as though Lysandra had crossed some threshold into an existence that only faintly resembled her previous life. She was now the Duchess of Ashford, a position that carried with it responsibilities she had never anticipated and privileges that she was still learning to navigate. The Duke's townhouse in London became her domain, a domain she discovered she possessed considerable talents for managing, employing the organizational skills she had developed whilst assisting Lady Ashworth, but now applied to a household of incomparably greater scope and significance. Yet it was the private dimension of her life that occupied the greater portion of her consciousness. The Duke, released from the constraints of propriety that had previously governed his behavior, revealed himself to be a man of extraordinary tenderness in intimate moments. His strength, which had been so apparent in public contexts, seemed to transmute itself into a form of careful devotion that took her breath away. He touched her, as though she was something precious and irreplaceable, and spoke to her in the darkness of their bedchamber with a poetry that she would never have expected from a man of his apparent severity. "You have restored to me something I believed myself to have irretrievably lost," he whispered one night as they lay together, her head resting upon his chest, his fingers tracing patterns across her spine with deliberate gentleness. "I had constructed a life of such careful solitude that I had ceased to believe in the possibility of authentic human connection. You have demonstrated that I was wrong in this conviction, and I am profoundly grateful for the lesson you have taught me." But it was not merely the intimate moments that constituted the substance of their union. They spent their days in companionable intellectual engagement. He would review the accounts that governed his various estates, whilst she sketched botanical specimens in a notebook that she had begun to fill with drawings of remarkable accuracy. They took meals together, and these meals became occasions for conversation that ranged across subjects both profound and trivial, building a shared vocabulary of references and inside jokes that seemed to weave them ever more thoroughly into a single integrated consciousness. The Duke's reputation, which had been formidable before their marriage, seemed to undergo a subtle but significant transformation. Those who had previously regarded him with fear began to perceive in him a capacity for humanity that had been obscured by his earlier severity. There were whispers that he had been transformed by love, a proposition that would have been scoffed at in earlier times, but which now seemed to carry a certain legitimacy. It was in the 3rd month of their marriage that Lysandra discovered she was with child, a discovery that seemed to accelerate the Duke's already considerable devotion into something approaching religious fervor. He insisted upon hiring the most accomplished physicians in London to monitor her health, and he began to speak of their forthcoming child with a tenderness that suggested he had previously believed himself incapable of such emotion. One evening, as they sat together in the library, he placed his hand upon her still slight abdomen and seemed to be listening for something that no one else could perceive. "Do you imagine it will be a son?" she asked, amused by the intensity of his concentration. "It matters not," he replied, and his voice carried absolute conviction. "Whether son or daughter, this child shall be the product of a union grounded in genuine affection rather than political convenience. This child shall know a father who loves its mother, not because convention demands it, but because he has recognized in her the essential completion of his own being. This child shall grow into a person who understands that authentic human connection is possible because its existence shall be proof of that possibility." He raised her hand to his lips and kissed it with a reverence that suggested he was performing some ancient ritual of consecration. "I believe," he said softly, "that our child shall be remarkable, not because of the elevated station it shall inherit, but because it shall be raised in an environment in which love is not a luxury, but a fundamental truth, acknowledged and celebrated without apology." Lysandra felt tears spring to her eyes, tears born not of sadness, but of a profound sense of gratitude that she had no adequate words to express. When she had entered the ballroom on the night of the assembly, she had believed that her life was predetermined, that her future had been essentially determined by circumstance and the whims of those more powerful than herself. She had not imagined that a simple stumble could precipitate such a transformation, not merely in her external circumstances, but in the fundamental understanding of who she was capable of being. The Duke drew her close, and they sat together in the amber glow of the firelight, two souls who had found in one another the completion that neither had dared to expect. Outside, winter pressed against the windows, but within the library, Warmth and hope seemed to have established permanent residence. The spring arrived with remarkable suddenness, transforming London's grey landscape into something approximating beauty. Gardens burst into bloom, the Thames reflected skies of brilliant blue, and Lysandra found herself increasingly occupied with the preparations that preceded the birth of her child. The Duke, who had been nearly insufferable in his protective vigilance throughout her pregnancy, had now begun to exceed even those elevated standards of concern. He had engaged a physician of such renowned expertise that the man had previously served the royal household itself. He had ensured that every possible comfort was available to her within their townhouse, and he had taken to spending entire evenings simply watching her sleep, as though he feared some malady might strike her down in the darkness, and he wished to be positioned to prevent it. "You are behaving," she informed him one evening with the gentle exasperation of a woman thoroughly accustomed to his particular form of devotion, as though pregnancy were an affliction rather than a natural process through which women have proceeded since the beginning of human civilization. "You are not merely any woman," he replied, kissing her forehead with the tenderness that had become his default mode of interaction with her. "You are the woman whose existence gives meaning to my own. Forgive me if I find myself disinclined to take any risk regarding your welfare." It was in May, as the wisteria that adorned the facade of their townhouse reached its peak of fragrant bloom, that the first labor pains commenced. The Duke, who had been working in his study when the servants informed him of her condition, arrived at her bedchamber with such speed that she would not have been surprised to learn he had simply dematerialized from one location and reconstituted himself in another. "I am here," he said, taking her hand and positioning himself at her side with the determination of a man who had no intention of being displaced. "I shall remain with you through this." The physician, a man of considerable consequence and equally considerable dignity, opened his mouth to protest this breach of convention, but the Duke's gaze suggested that any such objection would be received with considerably less courtesy than its utterance merited. The physician closed his mouth and proceeded with his examination without further comment. What followed was hours of labor that seemed to Lysandra to encompass both an instant and an eternity simultaneously. There were moments of such pain that she questioned her earlier conviction that childbirth was a natural process. There were intervals of relative peace in which she could observe her husband's face and perceive the concern etched into every line of his features. He spoke to her throughout, his voice a constant presence anchoring her to consciousness and to hope. He repeated the promises he had made on their wedding night. He assured her of his unwavering devotion. He described the child he anticipated meeting as though he had already made its acquaintance, and found it to be a person of remarkable character. "Our daughter," he said, and she perceived that he had at some point in the preceding months become convinced that the child would be female, "shall inherit your intelligence and your capacity for grace under adversity. She shall be formidable, Lysandra. She shall be a woman who bends the world to her will, rather than permitting the world to determine her fate." The final hours of labor brought with them a desperation that transcended mere physical suffering. Lysandra felt herself approaching the limits of her endurance, and she perceived in the physician's expression a concern that suggested he was making internal calculations regarding the relative probabilities of outcome. It was at this precise moment that the Duke leaned close to her ear and whispered words that seemed to contain all the love he had accumulated across their months of marriage, compressed into a single utterance. "You are the strongest person I have ever encountered. You have conquered the society that sought to diminish you. You have claimed a position of power and dignity through the simple refusal to accept the diminishment it attempted to impose. You shall conquer this as well. You shall do this because you are remarkable, because you are extraordinary, and because I have absolute faith in your capacity to endure anything." Perhaps it was the power of his conviction that sustained her. Perhaps it was the simple fact that she had discovered within herself a reserve of strength she had not previously recognized. Or perhaps it was merely that her body, having endured so much in her life, recognized that this final challenge was not insuperable. The child came into the world with a cry that seemed to announce itself as a declaration of intent, a statement that here was a life that refused to be silenced or diminished. Her daughter, precisely as the Duke had predicted, a small, furious creature of remarkable beauty, with eyes of grey-blue and hair that seemed to capture the light itself. The Duke, who in all his years had maintained a bearing of absolute control, actually wept. He held his daughter as the midwife cleaned away the evidence of the birth, and he looked upon her face with an expression of such profound love that Lysandra felt her own tears begin to flow, tears of relief, of exhaustion, of overwhelming gratitude that she had survived the ordeal and that the child had emerged intact and whole. "She is perfect," he whispered, and his voice shook with the force of his emotion. "She is absolutely perfect, and she is ours." They named her Eleanor, a name that meant bright light, and which seemed to capture something essential about the infant's fierce determination to assert her presence in the world. Within hours, word had spread throughout London that the Duke had fathered a daughter, and the implications of this fact began to permeate through the consciousness of society. A child born of genuine love, born to a mother of exceptional character, born to a father who had been transformed by the recognition that vulnerability was not weakness, but strength. This child seemed to symbolize something larger than its own individual existence. It seemed to suggest that love, authentic love grounded in genuine knowledge of another person, was not merely possible, but was capable of creating something entirely new and entirely extraordinary. Eleanor's first year of life proceeded with a rapidity that seemed to mock the passage of time. The infant grew from a small, furious creature into a person of distinct personality and considerable charm. She inherited her mother's thoughtful nature and her father's fierce determination, and she seemed to possess an unusual capacity for perceiving the emotional states of those around her. The Duke had become a different man, not fundamentally altered, for the essential character he possessed remained intact, but refined, softened in places where he had previously been rigid. He was often observed carrying his daughter through the gardens of his estates, explaining to her the names and properties of various plants in a manner that suggested he believed her to be capable of comprehension despite her inability to formulate verbal responses. Lysandra, observing her husband with their daughter, perceived that he was attempting to transmit to Eleanor the same lessons regarding strength and grace that he himself had learned. He was showing her through example that power and tenderness were not mutually exclusive, that a man could possess the capacity for both dominance and devotion. It was in Eleanor's 12th month of life that Lady Verena Calthorpe encountered the Duke and Duchess at a garden party that had been organized by the Duchess of Richmond. The setting was one of careful civility, and Lady Verena approached them with the smile that had become her trademark, the smile that never quite reached her eyes. "Your Grace," she addressed the Duke, employing his title with a precision that suggested she remained displeased by his choice of wife. "How delightful to observe you engaging in the trivialities of domestic life. One might almost have anticipated that you would have tired of such provincial contentment by now." The Duke, who had previously been inclined to respond to such provocation with cutting remarks, simply regarded her with an expression of such complete indifference that she seemed to understand that she no longer possessed the capacity to provoke him. "I have discovered," he said mildly, "that what I previously categorized as provincial contentment is in fact the profound fulfillment that derives from having organized one's existence around matters of genuine significance rather than the acquisition of superficial status. I find myself entirely satisfied with this arrangement." He then turned away from Lady Verena with a finality that suggested the conversation was concluded, and he directed his attention toward his wife and daughter with a focus that made it abundantly clear that Lady Verena and all she represented had been displaced from his consideration. Lysandra perceived in this moment the full extent of the transformation that had occurred within her husband. The man who had once been defined by his capacity for cold dismissal had become someone capable of such transcendent indifference to the judgments of those he no longer deemed worthy of his attention. It was a transformation that seemed to encompass not merely a change in behavior, but a fundamental alteration in his understanding of what constituted a valuable existence. As the summer progressed toward autumn, Lysandra found herself reflecting upon the journey that had brought her to this position of extraordinary privilege. She had entered the ballroom on that fateful evening, believing her life to be essentially predetermined, believing that her fate had been determined by circumstances beyond her control. She had not understood that a single moment of vulnerability, a simple stumble, an accident of coordination could precipitate such a radical transformation. The Duke, meanwhile, seemed increasingly inclined to examine the philosophy that had governed his earlier existence. He had begun to read more widely in domains of literature and philosophy, and he would discuss these readings with Lysandra in the quiet hours of evening, when Eleanor had been put to sleep and the household had settled into relative silence. "I have been reading Marcus Aurelius," he said one evening as they sat together in the library that had become the sanctuary of their marriage, and I find myself struck by his observation that we cannot control external events, but we can control the manner in which we interpret and respond to them. I spent decades constructing barriers against vulnerability, believing that by doing so, I could prevent suffering. In actuality, I was merely preventing joy. You have demonstrated to me that the capacity to suffer is inextricably linked to the capacity to love, and that this linkage is not something to be feared, but something to be embraced. The 10 years that followed Eleanor's birth witnessed a transformation in the social position of the Duke of Ashford that seemed to vindicate every assertion he had made regarding the nature of authentic power. A man who had previously been regarded with fear and suspicion was now perceived as a figure of moral authority, a man whose opinions on matters both political and philosophical seemed to carry weight that transcended his station. This alteration in perception resulted not from any deliberate effort on his part to court such regard, but rather from the simple fact that his genuine transformation had become evident to all who possessed the capacity to perceive it. Eleanor, who had grown into a girl of remarkable intelligence and considerable beauty, seemed to embody the finest qualities of both her parents. She possessed her mother's capacity for empathy and her father's fierce commitment to justice. She was educated by tutors of exceptional quality, and her education had been designed not to prepare her for the conventional role expected of women of her station, but rather to develop the fullest possible expression of her intellectual capacities. Lysandra herself had become a force within London society, not through the manipulation and calculated cruelty that had characterized Lady Verena's reign, but through a simple commitment to the welfare of those who occupied positions of vulnerability. She had established a school for young women of modest means, and she had worked tirelessly to ensure that girls who might otherwise have been consigned to lives of servitude or degradation possessed the opportunity to develop their talents and claim their own destinies. The Duke had supported this endeavor with unwavering commitment, providing both financial resources and, perhaps more significantly, the weight of his social authority to protect the school from the criticism and ridicule that inevitably emerged from those who believed that education was wasted upon the lower classes. On a spring evening in the 10th year of their marriage, as the gardens of their country estate exploded into bloom, and Eleanor played with the exuberance of a child secure in her parents' love, Lysandra found herself reflecting upon the extraordinary nature of the life she had constructed. The Duke found her in the rose garden, standing before the very bush upon which, a decade earlier, he had proposed marriage. He had learned, across the years, to recognize the particular quality of her silence when she was engaged in profound reflection, and he approached her with the quiet reverence that she had become accustomed to receiving from him. "What occupies your thoughts?" he asked, positioning himself at her side with the ease of absolute familiarity. "I was reflecting," she replied, "upon the improbability of this existence. That I, the daughter of a botanist and a woman of no particular consequence, should have become a duchess and the foundress of an institution dedicated to the welfare of young women. It seems scarcely credible." The Duke took her hand and raised it to his lips, a gesture that remained across a decade of marriage, capable of producing the same tremor of emotion that his first kiss had inspired. "It is credible," he said softly, "because it is the result of a love that is grounded in absolute authenticity. We did not marry because society demanded it, or because our union promised political advantage or financial consolidation. We married because we recognized in one another the essential completion of ourselves, and because we possessed the courage to act upon that recognition despite the costs it demanded." He gestured toward their daughter, who was chasing a butterfly through the blooming flowers with the single-minded determination that characterized all of her endeavors. "Our child," he continued, "shall grow into a woman who understands that her life is not circumscribed by the expectations of a society that fears her potential. She shall understand that love is not a limitation, but a liberation, that genuine human connection is the highest achievement available to us, and that the greatest power we possess is the capacity to choose, with absolute freedom and absolute certainty, the direction our lives shall take." Eleanor, perceiving that her parents had paused in their evening contemplation, came running toward them with the infectious joy of childhood. The Duke scooped her into his arms, and Lysandra wrapped her own arms around both of them, and in that moment, suspended between the beauty of the garden and the vastness of the star-filled sky, she perceived with absolute clarity that this was everything she had ever required. Years earlier, she had stumbled on the floor of a ballroom and experienced a moment of profound humiliation. That moment had seemed, in its instant, to be the culmination of a lifetime of inadequacy, the confirmation of every doubt she had harbored regarding her own worth, and yet it had proven to be not an ending, but a beginning, the first gesture in a symphony of love and transformation that had reshaped not merely her life, but the lives of everyone who had come into contact with it. The Duke held their daughter aloft, and Eleanor shrieked with delight as he swung her in slow circles beneath the vault of heaven. And Lysandra, watching this man who had once been armored against love, embraced the vulnerability that love demanded, understood that she had witnessed something far more significant than a simple romantic narrative. She had witnessed the proof that human beings possessed within themselves the capacity for radical transformation, that the barriers we construct against pain inevitably also serve to isolate us from joy, and that the choice to love, truly love, with absolute vulnerability and absolute certainty, was the most courageous choice available to us. As the stars emerged one by one across the darkening sky, and Eleanor's laughter echoed through the gardens, Lysandra felt a profound gratitude for the stumble that had changed everything, for it had taught her that life's greatest gifts often arrive disguised as catastrophe, and that the path to authentic happiness requires us to embrace the very vulnerability that society has trained us to fear. The Duke, setting Eleanor down and drawing his wife close, whispered words that had become his daily affirmation across a decade of marriage. "Thank you for permitting me to love you. Thank you for showing me that strength and tenderness are not opposites, but perfect complements. Thank you for being exactly who you are." And Lysandra, leaning into the warmth of his presence, replied with equal conviction, "Thank you for seeing me, truly seeing me, when the world was determined to render me invisible. Thank you for choosing me. Thank you for showing me that love, authentic and grounded in genuine knowledge of another person, is the most transformative force in the universe." Eleanor, sensing the profound emotion in her parents' embrace, wound her small arms around both of them, and in that moment, three souls seemed to merge into something greater than the sum of their individual parts. A family born not of obligation, but of choice, not of convenience, but of love, not of propriety, but of absolute authenticity. The evening deepened, the stars grew brighter, and within the gardens of the Duke's estate, love, that most dangerous and most necessary of human emotions, continued its eternal work of transformation. In a world that constantly seeks to diminish us, to constrain our possibilities within the narrow boundaries of what society deems appropriate, we often fail to recognize that our greatest moments of apparent failure frequently contain within them the seeds of our most profound transformation. The stumble that Lysandra experienced in that ballroom was not a confirmation of her inadequacy, but rather an invitation to claim her own power. And the Duke's willingness to move beyond the barriers he had constructed against vulnerability demonstrated that strength, true, authentic strength, lies not in our capacity to remain isolated and untouched, but in our willingness to open ourselves completely to another person, understanding that this openness carries with it both the possibility of profound joy and the risk of devastating loss. What the story illustrates, ultimately, is that love in its most authentic form requires us to abandon the carefully curated versions of ourselves that we present to the world. It demands that we reveal our vulnerabilities, our fears, our deepest uncertainties, and trust that the person who perceives these truths will not use them as weapons, but will instead recognize them as the foundations upon which genuine human connection can be constructed. When we possess the courage to love in this manner, completely, authentically, without reservation or self-protection, we do not diminish ourselves. Rather, we elevate ourselves and everyone we touch into something far greater than we could ever be alone. The question that echoes through this narrative is not whether love is worth the risk it demands. The question is, what are we if we refuse to take that risk? What becomes of our humanity when we choose isolation over vulnerability, safety over authenticity, the appearance of strength over the reality of genuine connection? The answer, which Lysandra and the Duke discovered across the course of their journey, is that such choices lead inevitably to a kind of living death, an existence devoid of meaning, purpose, or joy. It is only when we choose to love truly and completely that we discover what it means to be fully alive. Did this story move your heart? Did you find yourself believing in the transformative power of authentic love? If so, we invite you to join our growing community of devoted listeners. Please subscribe to our channel to ensure that you never miss a single tale of Victorian romance, redemption, and the extraordinary power of human connection. Your subscription helps us continue to create stories that remind us all of what it means to love and be loved with absolute authenticity. In the comments section below, we would be deeply honored to hear your thoughts. What aspect of Lysandra and the Duke's journey resonated most profoundly with you? Did you find yourself identifying with the vulnerability that love demands? What does authentic connection mean in your own life? Share your reflections with us. Your comments remind us why we do this work, and they create a community of hearts united in the belief that love, in its truest form, is the most transformative force in the universe. Once again, we thank you for permitting us to share this story with you. We thank you for the time you have invested in the lives of Lysandra and Caelum. We thank you for being part of our extended family of listeners who understand that stories, particularly stories of love, transformation, and the courage it takes to be truly seen, are not merely entertainment. They are mirrors in which we perceive the possibilities within ourselves. They are maps that guide us toward our own authentic paths. They are invitations to embrace vulnerability and claim the extraordinary lives that await us. Until our next story finds you, may you be blessed with the courage to love authentically, the wisdom to recognize transformation when it arrives, and the grace to see beyond the stumbles and falls to perceive the extraordinary person you are meant to become. Thank you, from the entire team at Victorian Romance Audio Stories, for allowing us to accompany you on this journey through the gardens of love, redemption, and the beautiful possibility of human connection.